I've got time for us to start, so we'll go by my watch this morning. Those of you who have received the sheet of paper, take a look at it just a moment. Quite some interesting information that I copied down. Especially look at that second paragraph. Any information that Adam or God wanted to hand down throughout the generations came through 2 generations of the human race when the flood came, and it was only in the 3rd generation by the time of Abraham. So what does that mean? That doesn't give much time for mistakes to work their way in. That's the point he's making. This makes the historicity of the book of Genesis to be very trustworthy. More people you have, the more ideas. You remember that old game that we used to play when we were kids called gossip? You made a big long circle and somebody whispered something into the ear of the person next to him, and then that person whispered to the next, and by the time it got around that circle, that wasn't the same thing that was started at the beginning. Of course, the very fact that somebody's come up with that as a game illustrates the truthfulness of it. Gossip is untrustworthy. But here you have very few people in between. They're not a huge circle. They're just those that are mentioned here. Notice also Noah's first paragraph, the end of it, Adam was still living when Noah's dad was born, because of these extremely long periods of time, ages that they lived. And Shem, who was the son of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, those 3, Shem outlived Abraham. A lot of these points you never stop to consider until you see it right in front of you, but just look at the chart below and it's quite informative. Notice also the 4th paragraph, Methuselah, who died after 969 years, the longest life lived of any person in the Bible. Methuselah died in the year of the flood. And then the writer hastened to add, but that doesn't mean that he perished in the flood. He probably died before the flood came, but that's certainly man's opinion. But the point of the whole thing, look at that last paragraph. This chart below shows the lifespan of people has progressively gotten shorter since the flood. Notice that on the chart itself, there are some people, in fact, let's see, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, and Jared, plus Methuselah, plus Noah, all of those that I've mentioned lived 900 years or more. The rest of them less. But look at the bottom of that chart and how that black line, which represents their life that they lived, notice how few. Cheryl, did you get one of these charts? So starting over with the time of Noah, you can see how long he lived, and then notice immediately how much shorter that gets until you get to the book of Psalms, and it says in Psalms that the average lifespan of a person was about the same as it is right now. So it hadn't changed since the time of David and Solomon. The Bible says 70 years, or if by reason of strength, 80 years. And what's the normal lifespan of people today? Well, we're hitting on it right there, between 70 and 80 years. That's a long lifespan. Point I want to make is, look how much shorter that it became when you get down to Shem, Noah's boy. And from there on, they're relatively short periods of time compared to what happened before the flood. Now keep that one point in mind, because it is very significant. What happened at the flood that would mean a lot of people's lives would be much shorter. The future of mankind on earth that he's going to live, it's a regular, probably a regular lifespan would be maybe 400 years, 300 years. That's an awful long time compared to today's average. But compared to Methuselah, look at Noah. Noah was 900 and what? 50? 900 and something. Okay, that brings us to Genesis chapter 1. We're still there after 2 weeks or more. We'll probably still be in Genesis chapter 1. Next week, hope you don't get bored with this, but to me this is a fascinating study when you stop to think about the many theories that are circulated, especially from the evolutionary world. It just doesn't fit what the Bible says. There is a vast discrepancy between evolution and creation. That is seen in, well, let's take a look at verses 6 and 7. Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." In case you're wondering what he's talking about, read the next verse. That's the usual answer that I give. God made the firmament. The firmament here basically means space. Maybe another word you might use, it's a little more understandable, would be atmosphere. But God made the firmament and divided the waters that were above the firmament from the waters that under the firmament, from the ones that were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. We're going to focus on that one verse most of the time this morning. The waters above the firmament and waters below the firmament, above and below, those are prepositions, but they're very important prepositions. What's he talking about? Waters above our atmosphere. And some say even the troposphere and ionosphere. We're talking about way, way on up in space. But it's easier for us to understand. The first heaven would be where the birds fly. The second heaven would be the planets and so on. And the third heaven would be where God is. So maybe that would kind of help us keep things straightened out. Waters, there were waters above the firmament in the book of Genesis chapter 1. They were there because God put them there. And he made a space in between them, the atmosphere. That could not have been a reference to clouds, because clouds, you can't see through clouds. They block the sun. You especially appreciate something like that whenever it's 115 degrees outside. Who knows, we may hit that here this summer. But 115 degrees outside, and you go out just to work maybe 5 minutes in the yard and you're sweating, and then a cloud comes, and all of a sudden it's about 15, 20 degrees cooler under that cloud. Why? Because the rays of the sun are not penetrating through that cloud. That's not what we have here. This is more like, instead of, well, maybe transparent or translucent, but it lets the light through, is the point that we're making. So it couldn't be referring to water droplets that we see today when it rains. First of all, because it did not rain. Notice Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, there was no rain on the earth in those days. All of this is information we need to remember. No rain on earth when this was going on. When did rain on the earth first start? It appears to me in the days of Noah. God used the rain, the water that was below the firmament and the waters that were above the firmament. We'll go more explanation of that here in just a moment, but first of all, realize it did not rain. Not only that, Genesis 9 verse 13 says, and there was no bow in the cloud. Well, you know what that means. That no rainbow. God said you're going to see a rainbow in chapter 9. Every time it rains, there's a rainbow somewhere. So what we're talking about here is something highly unusual. Waters above the firmament. Now, the idea that I suggested last week, I'll have to admit, it is a theory. But remember, when you use the word theory, it's that which cannot or has not been proven. And yet, from all of the facts that we're going to notice here in just a few minutes, it's almost a proven fact. There was a water vapor canopy surrounding the earth, and I'm talking about the whole earth, this terrestrial ball on which we live, sort of like what we see with Saturn. You know, you've seen pictures of Saturn, and it has a number of rings around Saturn. So picture one of those rings being this water vapor canopy. But it wasn't just in one place on the earth, it was around the entire earth. That would mean that life on earth back then was a lot different than it is today. We'll notice a few of those differences here in just a moment. But notice that water below, I don't have a problem with that, but the waters above, that is the one that's most interesting to me. Water vapor has the ability to transmit solar radiation from the Earth's surface. And it would serve as a gigantic greenhouse. We would have a greenhouse effect. I assume you've been in the greenhouse at various nurseries and bought some flowers or vegetable plants or whatever. What's the purpose of that greenhouse? To keep everything at an even temperature. And you can grow things almost year-round in a greenhouse. You see where I'm going? Quite different than outside. As I mentioned last Lord's Day, do you remember hearing about giant woolly mammoths being discovered? They dug down in ice and they find a carcass of a mammoth encased in that ice. Now, that's unusual, but not as unusual as what I'm going to say next. Because in the mouth of a mammoth was a plant that he was eating. And they don't have that in the Antarctica. You don't have vegetation in Antarctica. That means sometime in the past, Antarctica was not just a bunch of ice. There were mammoths living there, number one. They had vegetation on the ground, number two. So what happened? In short, a flood happened. And it changed the geography, or what they call the topography, of the world, and it has never been the same since. But that's what I want us to notice about the greenhouse effect. Notice also nearly uniform temperatures. There would not be 120 degrees one part of the earth, and on the other part of the earth, it would be 30 degrees below freezing. You wouldn't have that. You don't have that in a greenhouse. And they didn't have that in Noah's day either, prior to the flood. There was a uniform temperature pretty much anywhere you went. Sort of like today, I don't know what the average temperature, let's say in Hawaii, is, but I would say it's probably a much smaller range between cold and hot than we have here. Now, not only that, but in that period of time, let's see, the combination of warm water and enough adequate moisture everywhere would cause a lot more vegetation to grow, and much easier than it would be today. How much vegetation do you think grows in the Sahara Desert? Too hot, nothing but sand. Back before Noah's day, that wasn't true. Things were much different then. All over the earth, you could see vegetation growing. Now, just because it did not rain until after the flood, that doesn't mean that plants were in need of water. It says a mist went up. What's a mist? Well, you get a mist whenever you get a high humidity. So keep that in mind also. All over the world, There weren't barren sand deserts back then, nor did they have ice caps. The temperature was pretty much regulated around the entire ball because the whole thing was encased in this water vapor canopy. In other words, it was a gigantic greenhouse. Now, on top of that, did you ever wonder why that animals were allowed to live so long? And what about, why is it that human beings live? I mean, a man could live 969 years. Why? I was reading yesterday about what they call hyperbaric chambers. We'll talk about more in just a moment, but this world was pretty much a hyperbaric chamber. Today, for example, if you are badly burned and you're rushed to a hospital, you want to go to a hospital that has a hyperbaric chamber. You know why? Well, because in a hyperbaric chamber, healing takes place much, much faster. I looked into Google and it gave me some information regarding hyperbaric chambers. Listen to this. This is from AI Overview. The concept of a hyperbaric chamber environment in pre-flood era suggests that the Earth's atmosphere before the Great Flood was denser, the atmosphere was more dense, and had a higher oxygen content than it does today, potentially creating a natural hyperbaric chamber. But those of you who have computers, go and look up, type in hyperbaric chamber. I did, and I added in Oklahoma at the end of it, and pow, it came right up. And I found out, I didn't know they had a small one right down here at the Norman Regional Hospital, hyperbaric chamber. Other major hospitals have hyperbaric chambers, especially for burn victims, but also for those cases where they need quick healing. Did you know before the flood, the whole world was a hyperbaric chamber? No wonder they lived so long. Animals lived so long and got so large. Let's go on. The theory proposes that increased pressure and oxygen levels could have contributed to longer lifespans. Remember the chart that you looked at a moment ago? Why is it that people living in the days of Moses around 1500 BC, why is it that their lifespan was much shorter than the first, say, 10 listed on that chart? Adam and Seth and Enosh and Canaan and Mahalalel, right on down to Jared and Enoch and Lamech, and then Noah. He was over 600 years. So lifespan would be increased, and the growth of larger plants and larger animals would take place. And we're still discovering large animals. I don't know if that was mentioned on the backside or not. Well, listen to this. Secular scientists, by that I mean probably non-religious scientists, who deny the biblical account of Earth's history, also believe that oxygen levels still had to be much higher in the ancient past. Now, that's quite an admission. That's the point that I'm making. When we combine this new hyperbaric oxygen therapy with known lifespans of pre-flood people like Methuselah, it strengthens the position that some creation scientists hold that pre-flood atmosphere favored better health and longer lives as a result of increased atmospheric pressure and higher oxygen levels. You could turn that thing up to 100% on oxygen level. Why do people who have trouble, let's say, with their lungs and breathing, why do so many of them use oxygen? Well, I'm grateful that we have machines where we could increase the oxygen intake. This factor could then be added with other likely scenarios conferring long lives, and you compare that with the presence of a non-mutated, that's another subject, but a non-mutated condition of the human genome prior to the global flood. After the flood, we see a marked decay curve in the human lifespan. That's why I was pointing out a moment ago. See how much shorter those lives were after the flood? So this chamber, hyperbaric chamber that we had here on Earth, brought about longer lifespans and healthier conditions. I don't know when the first doctor you read in the Bible, it may have been Luke, but they had some kind of people, I would assume, doctoring people back in the days of Noah and earlier. Okay, later, when this water vapor canopy was needed, waters were needed to provide a additional amount of water upon the earth. The floods opened up from beneath and from above. We've been talking about the above part here this morning. This writer makes this point: the content of water vapor in our atmosphere today, right now, if it all was rained out, if it all precipitated, it would cover the earth only to a depth of about 1 inch. So that's interesting. How deep are those waters that covered the earth back in Noah's day? Well, we'll get to that in chapter 6 through 9 here in a few weeks. So the waters under the firmament still would be, back in Noah's day, I mean even before, in pre-flood days, let's say, remember the waters there would be like an ocean without a shore. Water were mixed in with matter everywhere, way back in the beginning when God created matter, and then he began to work on that matter and separate one from another, the waters above from the waters below. And then he said, let dry land appear, and it did. Now you had a further separation of God, that with land being separated from the water. In Genesis 1:9 it says, and let the waters under heaven be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, with the gathering together of the waters, and called seas. Now, they were nothing like the seas that we have today. The Adriatic Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean. This earth was totally changed when Noah walked out after that flood. I think it was like a year and 10 days, wasn't it? Anyway, a little over a year, he walked out into a totally different world. I'm talking about geographically speaking. So, remember, the light had been divided from the darkness on the first day. The waters above the firmament divided from the waters below the firmament on the second day. And then dry land now appears on the third day. It's interesting to write all these things down. You can see it better and probably remember it better by writing down what happened on each of the first 6 days of creation. All those waters, it said, were connected, were in one place. How's that worded? Verse 9, let heaven under the heaven, let the waters be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. Waters in one place. I assume that means primarily that all of the waters of the various seas and so on that they had, that they were connected with running from one body to another body of water. So had conduits of water going from one to another. Therefore, they were called together. But remember, formless matter that God created originally has been used now to make up solid ground. And he separated a lot of that water, and dry land appeared. I think all of that should be put in contrast to what you see in verse 2. The earth was without form, and it was void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. Creation began. I'd like to see a lot more of that. Noah wouldn't even be able to see it. Some of the things that Noah was able to see, I was reading about this morning, would let him know that God cared for him. The land Eden was selected after Noah was already alive. A lot of this time information thing, you ought to sit and let your mind wander, then go back and check what the Bible actually says. But it's a fascinating story. Now, notice in verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Notice, this is important too, that plants were made not as seeds, but full-grown plants whose seed was in themselves. God created a tree, other plants, animals, insects, and notice that every one of them had an appearance of age. That's fascinating. How old do you think Adam looked 5 minutes after he was created? I would guess, pure human guess, that 25, maybe 30 years old. But he was created full grown, whose seed was in himself, just like it was in the world of plants. So it was in animals. This has caused some people who doubt the validity and integrity of the Bible. It's caused some people to say, God, if what you people, you creationists, are telling me, God would be a deceiver. He's trying to get you to think that Adam was really 30 years old when in reality he'd just been created 5 minutes ago. Therefore, God is trying to deceive you. Well, I've heard that argument made. But the point is that this is not a divine deception, but rather it is a necessary accompaniment, necessary for that to accompany anything that's been created. God's purpose was not to deceive. God's purpose was to create. When you create from nothing, ex nihilo. But man comes up with all kinds of statements trying to prove now that God's a liar. He's trying to deceive us. No. God is simply creating something full grown. Whenever we cut the tree down where our house now sits, there was a huge tree there. And somebody here in town liked that tree a lot. I don't know who it was, but he or she wrote a poem about it. It's a very nice little poem. And they mentioned they think they needed to tear that tree down so they could plant a house, but we're sure going to miss that tree. Kids played under the tree and all this. Well, it was a good poem, I agree, but there's no way we could have had our house built without the tree coming down. When the tree came down, it was quite interesting, because I started counting the rings in that tree. Don't remember exactly, but it was somewhere over 90 rings in that huge tree, which I would say probably the base of that tree was about the distance between Barbara and me. It was a huge tree. Took a while to count all the rings. What's the point? When God made that first tree, I don't know how old he made it appear to be. He could have made it appear to be 91, 92 years of age, putting the rings in the tree, because he created it full grown. This is the same way he created man, full grown. Man did not come from a little amoeba or paramecium, and the sun's ray shined on that little cell and irritated it and caused it to grow. And then finally, here we have a human being. Billions of years later. No, it happened in a matter of days. God created everything full grown. Okay, now, if everything was to produce after its own kind. Here's another long class period, maybe 2 or 3 classes dealing with that subject. What do you mean kind? You mean phylum? You mean just class? Variety? I know that the evolutionary doctrine teaches that all things that are created, all things that are here on earth are interrelated. That's where the idea comes from that you were once, well, your mom and daddy, all the way back, go back to not to Noah, where we would say 8 souls saved on that ark, but to them it's quite different. Your mom and dad, maybe 100 greats in front of that word, father and mother. Your father and mother, great granddad or grandmother was an ape. I still remember this was taught, and probably still is in classes in public school. Mother was telling me about when she was young that the teacher was teaching that point, and one of the students, a young girl, stood up and she told the teacher, well, you may have sprung from an ape, but I sure didn't. Well, that might have brought the class down. At least I appreciate the fact the young lady stood up, just told what she believed. The term morning and evening, D-A-Y. We talked about this last week. How long was a day? Some say a day was 1 billion years. And then we had day 2, another 1 billion years. Where in the world did they get this information? Well, it's just a figment of their imagination. They think that if we have enough years here, some say even trillion, but if we give it billions of years time to happen, then there's a greater possibility that it'll happen. This is the idea that take my watch and completely, totally disassemble it, take every aspect inside that watch out and lay it on a table. How often would you have to throw that thing up in the air and let it come down until it finally one time it hits and it's now reassembled? I maintain that I can give you 1 billion years and you'll still never do it. And you can give these evolutionary scientists billions and billions of years, but they'll never be able to create something from nothing. No wonder they hate the idea of origins so much. Okay, one more point. Light rays were made shining upon the earth as it rotated on its axis during the first, second, and third days before the sun was made on day 4. In other words, there still was a form of light coming from outside, shining upon the earth, and it was similar to the light that was going to be had when the sun and moon started. Probably not near as powerful, but light was there. I know that because the Bible says He created light from darkness, but it's only till you get on day 4 that He created the sun. So light was coming during the first 3 days and nights somewhere on the earth, which proves that it was turning on its axis even then. And notice this, it did not take 1 billion years for the light from a star who is billions of light years away from the earth. It didn't take 1 billion years for that light to get here. Because the light, the trail of light from the star was created, this book says, in transit. It was created when God said for it to be so, full grown. It appeared to be so many billion years old, but it wasn't. It happened right then. We're trying to answer a lot of the evolution